Thank you, everyone, for being here with me this evening. It's been a long time coming. I've had this conversation with Ordell for possibly over a year now about having the opportunity to present to you all. So really excited to be at this place and having a chance to share with you, even though it is virtual, but hopefully it means there's many folks involved who might not be able to otherwise. So I guess, I don't really need an introduction at this point, but I did want to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam First Nation. But much of the work that I'll be talking about today was occurred on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Williams Lake First Nation. So this research has been ongoing since 2016. And certainly the fires in 2017 played a big role in how we think about fire. But this research really began as a collaboration between ourselves as researchers, the Williams Lake First Nation, and the Williams Lake Community Forest. So I want to acknowledge that some of the kind of information and topics that I'll be talking about today may be a little bit triggering, particularly around fire, as I know was experienced by many people in the community in 2017, and also topics around colonization and kind of colonial impacts in the region. And there's one point in particular near the end where I'll actually show this slide again with just the kind of small sapling pictured on the left. And at that point, I will be talking about some of the bigger impacts of colonization. And if you'd prefer not to hear about that, then please feel free to step away, and I'll show the tree on the right at the end of that piece of the conversation. And at that point, it is safe to rejoin. So I'll start with this photo and ask the question, well, why do we want to think about history, and why do we want to think about the past? And for me, I really think that fire is such a complex challenge today that thinking about it at a historical lens can really help us think about where we've come from and how we've gotten to where we are today. And if you look at this photo, depending on your historical interests, we might see different things. But for me, I look at the hill in the background and I see an open forest. A forest that likely had lots of fire in it, maintaining an open forest structure and really minimizing the likelihood of more catastrophic fire impacts. And this photo was actually part of an article in the Williams Lake Tribune talking about the history of Williams Lake. And this is a photo from the 1800s looking at the current Glendale area. And essentially what I see is a forest that looks very different than perhaps the forests that we see around Williams Lake today. But things change through time. And this is a quote from that I read in somebody who had quoted this book of Branwen Pottenad's in describing the Williams Lake area in 1860. Saying several of the hills that enclose the valley of Williams Lake are covered with pasture of the finest description. And in the valley and on the slopes are hundreds of acres of prairie that would well repay the labor of the agriculturalist. So this is maybe a very different picture than what we would see today. I wouldn't imagine that people who are thinking about fire are imagining that the Williams Lake area is surrounded by hundreds of acres of prairie. But as we know, things changed over time. And this is a photo from the 1920s that was provided by the Museum of the Caribou Chilcotin. And this is actually what is now Mackenzie Avenue, looking west towards the Flat Rock area. So that hillside, you can see, is a little bit not nearly as treed as well. And it's important to kind of look back through time to understand how these forests have changed through time. And this is a photo that Ordell probably recognizes very well. He actually shared this with me of Williams Lake from the 1930s. And again, certainly not nearly as much development as we would see today. And perhaps we're starting to see some of the trees on the right-hand side growing into what would have potentially been those agriculturalists' dream that we heard earlier in the quote. And that if you look in the kind of far distance, that background hillside of flat rock is actually starting to ingrow as well. So these kinds of photos and quotes can tell us a lot about how things have changed through time. But one of the things that I really think about is how fire itself has changed through time. And we can kind of do that by thinking about how fire exists in the landscape today. So when we talk about historical fire regimes, what we're really describing is historical fire frequency, so how often fire occurred, and fire severity. And within the work that I do, we describe fire severity as the amount of kind of above ground tree mortality. So there's different ways to describe it, but that's how we use the term. And there's different kinds of fire that happens all across BC and has historically. And on the left-hand side is a photo of what we would call maybe a stand maintaining fire or a low severity fire. The kind of fire that really only burns along the ground, potentially kills some smaller, younger, more vulnerable trees, but helps really kind of regenerate these open forest structures. And on the right-hand side is a stand initiating fire, which would be kind of more characteristic perhaps of the boreal forests further north. And these are the ones that would kill large groups of trees and allow a new generation of trees to kind of all establish at once. So initiating a new stand of trees. And this diagram from James A.G. in 1993 kind of is a little bit complex, but it helps us think about these fire regimes and the fact that fire regimes were not all either low severity or high severity through time. They're actually quite a bit more complex than that. So on the left-hand side, well, across the bottom, you can see the measures of severity. So low and then mixed severity and high severity. On the left-hand axis is the proportion of individual fires within that fire regime. So essentially what this is saying is that in a low severity fire regime, you're going to have a high proportion of low severity fires. So if you think about 300 years, say, most of the fires that occur are going to be of the low severity type. But that doesn't mean that mixed severity or high severity fires were not a part of those regimes either. So even in a low severity fire regime, we have different kinds of fire. And then if we go to the kind of opposite side, we also see that low severity fires are a small component of high severity fire regimes. So are moderate severity fires, but then high severity fires are going to be mostly what occurs in a high severity fire regime. So the fire regime is really describing these fire frequencies and fire severities across time. So it's much bigger than just an individual fire, but it's thinking about kind of the way fires exist on a landscape through time. And then there's this kind of big middle area that's a little bit more complex and a little bit more difficult to actually disentangle and understand what proportion of low, moderate, and high severity fires may have been influencing these mixed severity fire regimes. And increasingly, we're coming to understand that mixed severity fire regimes were really important in the dry forest ecosystems across BC. And some of the work that we do within the tree ring lab uses tree rings to understand these historical fire regimes in two different ways. So on the left, we see a cross section of a fire scar. And this is a lodgepole pine tree that was sampled from the Flat Rock area, which I'll show a map of in a second, that has 3 fire scars embedded in them, in it. So the fire scars are those kind of black, like half circles or edges that you can see, and they're dated in this sample to 1833, 1848, and 1863. So what's really interesting about this sample is that the tree was really only this big around, so no bigger around than putting your thumb and your forefinger together when it survived its first fire. And remember, this is a lodgepole pine, which we often associate with higher severity fire. But it survived a fire when it was only 7 years old, and then burned in 1833, burned 15 years later in 1848, and then burned 15 years later again in 1863. And it survived all three of those fires that happened in relatively quick succession. And so this is a different kind of fire. So fire scars are really showing us evidence of low severity fire events. So again, these low severity fires might cause an injury to a tree, but it's not necessarily going to kill them. The other interesting pattern you might notice on this tree is that after 1863, there is no fire recorded for nearly 150 years. So again, the fire scars are really indicative of this low severity kind of fire. But the fire scars can't provide evidence necessarily of high severity fire. But what can are the individual ages of trees. And when we take those across a bigger landscape and we group them together, we can begin to see periods during which large groups of trees established that may be indicative of a higher severity fire event. And as you can see from the three cores that are taken out of a tree, these three have dates that all align pretty similarly, 1755, 1750, and 1753. So all of these trees established within a 5-year kind of window of each other. So this is going to provide us evidence of those higher severity fires in what we call a cohort, which is just a word for a group of trees that all establishes at one time. If you're not actually familiar with interpreting these, looking at tree rings, the middle on the left where the kind of bullseye pattern is, that's representative of the center of the tree. So the period, the point at which the tree was kind of born. And then on the right-hand end of these is the bark. So this is kind of a small core that was taken out of a tree. So again, these groups of trees can tell us a little bit more about higher severity fire. But as I mentioned, we're increasingly interested in these mixed severity fire regimes, so we can put these two lines of evidence together to think about fires in the past. And in addition to the kind of frequency and severity of fires, it's important to understand what the drivers of these fire regimes have been. What's actually causing these fires to exist on the landscape, and how are they distributed? With the hope that maybe we'll be able to reintroduce some of those important drivers in a way that might be different than how we've managed fire over the last 100 years. So finally, now getting to the Flat Rock area. If you're not familiar with it, it's this area outlined in red here. So it's essentially the kind of hillside that's up to the west of Williams Lake, between the Fraser River, Highway 20, and the Williams Creek Valley to the north. So it's about 6,000 hectares in size. And this portion of the community forest, the Williams Lake Community Forest was established in 2014 and is co-managed by the Williams Lake First Nation and the city of Williams Lake for multiple social, cultural, economic, and ecological values. But certainly since 2017, community protection from wildfire has been one of the key kind of drivers influencing the land management there. So as I mentioned early on, this was a really collaborative research project, and kind of throughout the life of the research, we worked really closely with the Williams Lake First Nation, particularly the archaeologists and several of the elders there, as well as the community forest managers, so that we were all able to kind of contribute expert knowledge of the site, of the fire, and of the ways in which our historical understanding of place could help influence our future management. And this really helped us, I think, from my perspective anyway, really kind of bring together lots of ways of understanding the interactions of people and fire through time, and make it much more applicable to the ways in which and the decisions that we make around managing the forests today. And so, unsurprisingly, the first thing that we learned is really that the history of Flat Rock is about people. As I mentioned, this is the traditional territory of the Williams Lake First Nation, and they have stewarded these lands since time immemorial. There's archaeological evidence in the region to support this up to about 6,500 years ago, with lots of the oral stories and histories talking about occupation in winter villages here. Some of the stories shared to us by the elders talk a lot about using Flat Rock for fishing, hunting, and berry picking up until the mid-1900s. And then there was a new group of people who found value in the area, with the gold rush starting in the 1860s. And slowly, more and more people began to colonize the area, potentially using those agriculturalist dream pastures that were all around Williams Lake. By the 1970s, this particular block, Flat Rock, was used for conventional logging, particularly up on the top of the slope. And then by 2014, it became a community forest. When we talked to the elders about what they valued and remembered about Flat Rock itself, there were lots of values that were discussed. And although they hadn't been back to the site in many, many decades for some of them, it was obvious that there was a really enduring connection to place. And these are some of the many values that they talked about, particularly the importance of salmon and salmon fishing being a really kind of communal activity that they did, being able to hunt kind of further up on the kind of plateau area that's more kind of up at the Essler side. And then also using lots of the kind of plants and animals for various other kind of spiritual, medicinal, and food species as well. They talked about the kind of benches of the Fraser River being the area where the berries would ripen earliest. And so it was one of the kind of first sources of nutrition that they were able to access. And unsurprisingly, the history of Flat Rock is also about fire. So these are some examples of fire-scarred trees. And you may have, if you've been out in the bush at all, which I suspect many of you have, these are fire-scarred trees that have the recordings of fire embedded within them. So this is kind of what they look like before you take the cross section and you sand it all down. So on the left and the right are two photos of live standing trees with fire scars embedded in them. And on the left-hand side, I'm pointing to an edge that counts as one fire scar. And on the right-hand photo, you might be able to see lots of different folds in that particular tree. And each one of those kind of folds or ridges is an individual fire recorded in that tree. Because of the Douglas fir beetle infestation at Flat Rock, there was also a lot of kind of harvesting that was done to help to mitigate the advance of the Doug fir beetle. And so we also were able to access a lot of stumps where you can see a fire scar within this stump. And in here, it looks a little bit white. And this is a fire scar that's actually embedded within the tree. And so if we were just looking at this tree from the outside, we actually wouldn't have been able to see the fire scar, but because the tree had actually been harvested, we were able to look at the fire scars embedded within them. So there's lots and lots of this kind of evidence of fire out at Flat Rock. And luckily, we were able to work with the community forest managers, the archaeologists, and the elders to sample these fire scars in an ethical way, and also in a way that wouldn't damage kind of future economic activities. So this is one tree, that Douglas fir tree, that had actually been harvested back in the 1930s. So it was actually a stump that we found out on the forest, and it's recording 10 different years of fire, starting in the 1600s and through to the 1790s. So each of those black arrows is actually pointing to one of those fire scars. And if you're interested in what's going on in the rest of it, most of these are pretty rotten, but actually where the fire burns, it kind of carbonizes the wood and really maintains the wood structure through time. The big white patch is actually a bunch of glue that we had to use to keep the sample held together while we were sanding it. We use a lot of glue and duct tape in this business. But, really amazingly, we were still able to date these 10 different fire scars that happened over that 200-year period. And what's also really interesting, not unlike the first cross-section that I showed you, is that this tree had 223 years between its last fire scar in 1794 and when it was actually harvested in the 1930s. So we're seeing this pattern begin to emerge where there was a lot of fire on the landscape and perhaps a lot less fire that we're seeing today. So this is a chart that's called a cumulative fire history chart. And essentially what it's showing is that there's a timeline across the bottom that goes from 1495 to the present day. And the red bars are showing you the percentage of plots that we put out at Flat Rock. So we put 20 plots out at Flat Rock, the percentage of those 20 plots that actually had a fire scar recorded at the plot. So the smaller the bar, that means there was maybe only one plot or two plots actually recorded, whereas the higher the bar means that fire was actually recorded at lots of plots. The blue line is telling you the recorder depth. So that's just saying that, not all trees can live forever. So essentially kind of our trees only go back to the 1500s. But at that point in time, there were only three plots that actually had trees that were living. And so through time, we actually have more and more and more trees that are actually able to record fire. So what's interesting about this is that essentially between 1554 and 1982, there were 83 individual years that had a fire scar in them. And that gives us a median interval of about 18 years. And that's just at the plot level. But at the site level, so at the scale of the whole of Flat Rock, there was a fire burning there once every 4 years on average. And that's a lot of fire. It's not a lot of fire since 2016, given 2017 that we've experienced recently, but it was a lot of fire happening here historically. So you can see kind of through time that some of the fires are really localized. So around 30% of fires actually were only burning in one single plot. And these plots were about a hectare in size. But some of those fires, the ones in 1870, 1794, those ones noted there in gray, those were burning a little bit more widespread. And when we combine this with the ages of the trees, so remember the top graph is those fire scars, so like the picture in the top right here, but we can also look at the tree cores. We can also begin to see an interesting pattern emerge. So this is along the same timeline, and this is showing that the bars are the density of trees that established in any 15-year window, with the subcanopy trees in the dark gray and the canopy trees in the light gray. And that's a differentiation we actually made in the field ourselves. And essentially you can see starting in the 1840s that there's a lot more trees that are starting to establish. So you can see kind of a step change, an increase in the density of trees. And then you can see another increase in the density starting in the kind of 1885 to 1900 age range. So when we put these two lines of evidence together, what I'm seeing is a place that had a long history of highly frequent fire, during which there was not much tree establishment, followed by a period in which we had a lot less fire on the landscape and a lot more trees establishing. And so if you think back to those photos that I showed kind of early on about those open grown forests, I think those photos are really representing what we're seeing more on the left-hand side of this graph, where there was highly frequent fire and not very much tree establishment. Whereas what we're seeing today is the result of not having enough fire on the landscape and a lot more trees being established. And so as I mentioned early on, one of the kind of key questions of the research was, well, what is actually driving these fire regimes? And so one of the things that we really kind of looked into historical documents and our work with the elders was understanding how Indigenous fire stewardship actually played a role in these landscapes. So Indigenous fire stewardship kind of encompasses highly diverse, both fire use, but also land use in ways that would have affected fire. There was often a higher incidence of fire kind of near community centers and along travel routes. And these intentional fires would often reduce the likelihood of future fires or the intensity of future fires as well. And so these are just a few quotes that I was able to find around some of these around Indigenous fire stewardship in the region. And the first one says, the Indigenous peoples have set fire to the woods in several places. And the second one from 1914 says, they burn the forest every year to light the salmon up the Fraser River, as well as to improve hunting. So these quotes kind of speak to fire stewardship being used in different ways for different objectives, and certainly something that was often talked about in a way that was kind of a curiosity by the early settlers who are writing these journals and these reports. And then we kind of shifted into the way that we think about fire. So we shifted from a model of Indigenous fire stewardship into a model of fire control. And this is a photo from the BC Archives on the right of a kind of public advertisement in Manning Park, talking about the one who dropped the cigarette should be hanged because it had started a fire. And then there's this quote from the Fulton kind of Forest Commission that happened in 1910 that said, we have in mind the active prevention of fire by the systematic work of a well-knit government organization, that the timber upon which our whole future as a lumber-producing country depends should be left under the imminent menace of fire is so absurd that regulation is imperative. So what we're seeing here is a very different view of fire. And what we're seeing is that these kind of broad perspectives that were happening, this shift that was happening within the province is really starting to have some more local scale impacts. So when we talked to the elders specifically about their understanding of fire and how they would have used it, one of the elders reflected and said, the only intentional burning I ever saw was around my reserve. But they had an elder who said, the one who knew it or who knew about fire would tell the chief, okay, maybe we should go there because we burnt, so it should be good now. So the elder here is really describing how their knowledge of fire was kind of embedded within a more colonial context, being within the reserve. And also that this knowledge kind of had existed within the community about how to use intentional fire and the effects that that would have had on the landscape. And so one of the things that we did kind of within this research was we maybe stopped asking specific questions about fire and started thinking more broadly about how the landscape had changed through time to then be able to interpret the role that fire had in shaping those landscapes. And so we're going back to the tree rings a little bit here. And one of the things that we did was we differentiated each of those 20 plots into either low severity through time or mixed severity through time. So if you think back to that original graph, we're kind of on the left end of those two fire regimes through time. And these are two examples at the plot scale of fires and the trees that we're establishing at that point in time. So again, across the bottom, we have a timeline. And the bars are indicative of the density of trees that established in any given 15-year window. In this plot, each triangle represents one fire. So the triangles that are in red are widespread fires, so those that burned in more than 30% of plots. The black triangles are those fires that burned in more than one plot, and the open triangles are those that only burned in a single plot. So from this example in plot 42, we can see 4 widespread fires. So those 4 red triangles, and I can't count it that fast, but at least 10 black triangles as well. So lots and lots of highly frequent fire is happening in this plot. And then after those fires stop, so the last one being in maybe the early 1900s, we see a large group of trees that establish where that black bar is. So a cohort of trees that was much more dense than any of the establishment that happened before that while the fires were actually happening. And so in this case, we're actually interpreting these cohorts or these groups of trees as something that established in the absence of fire. So normally fire would be burning in these places and killing a certain number of trees, maintaining those open forest conditions. But as soon as fire was taken out of these ecosystems, we then had a lot more trees establishing at the plot level. So on the left-hand side, those were the low severity plots, and this is an example of a mixed severity plot. So in these plots, we had fire and cohorts that kind of were happening at the same time. So in this plot 38, you can see a widespread fire, so that red triangle there, followed by a cohort that's indicated by the the green bar. And that cohort is actually occurring directly in response to that widespread fire. So in this case, what we're actually seeing is a fire that would have been possibly of moderate or higher severity, and then that allowed a group of trees to establish because it would have killed lots of trees in the area. So there's a slight kind of difference in the way that that the cohorts are actually establishing and when they're actually occurring. And I think from a kind of bigger ecosystem perspective, this means to me that it wasn't just open forests and grasslands like the plot on the left might indicate, but it was also forests that were a little bit more dense, but they weren't nearly as kind of well distributed as we might see today. So this is a little bit technical, and I'm happy to answer questions about this kind of later on. But what's really important about this distinction is that 10 plots were identified through the tree rings as low severity through time, and 10 plots were identified as mixed severity through time. And these low severity plots often had this really kind of characteristic impact where you had lots and lots of fire and most of the trees, if not all of the trees, establishing after the fire ended. So these are all of those plots that were identified as low severity. But again, the reason this distinction is really important because it can help us think about the drivers of fire. And so the two graphs on the bottom are the two graphs that you've already seen of the cumulative fire histories. But now we're adding on the low severity fire plots on the top and the mixed severity fire plots in the middle. So here, each plot is indicated by a line, the black line, and the length of the line indicates the ages of trees. Every red or yellow tick is one fire scar, and the black triangles are cohorts. And so if we were seeing, say, a high severity fire that had occurred, even like the 1870 fire, if that had been all high severity, we would have expected that all of the cohorts would have lined up. So we would have had all these triangles stacked on top of each other in 1870. But we're not seeing any effects like that. Really, these cohorts are distributed through time. So they're slowly kind of establishing in different places at different times. You can see in the low severity plots, so those 10 lines at the top, that the cohorts, the triangles are kind of further on the right, so they're occurring later in time. Whereas in the mixed severity plots, those 10 in the middle, those are actually kind of occurring concurrently with the highly frequent fire that's existing. And so when we go back to this distinction between low severity through time and mixed severity through time, what we're really seeing is the influence of Indigenous fire stewardship on creating a certain level of pyrodiversity. So these low severity plots that we identified kind of independently through the tree rings, these were coincident with those areas that elders and archaeological evidence showed were the main winter village sites, summer fishing camps, and travel corridors in between important sites. And on the right hand, the top right is a photo of an elder teaching me about the pitch that's coming from that culturally modified tree. And on the bottom right is a photo, both of these from Flat Rock, of a juniper tree that was talked about as being really important, and the type of ecosystem that we might have expected when fires were occurring very frequently. But what we've seen is that since fire has been removed from these landscapes and the cohort that is establishing, we're seeing that these forests have transitioned into something that's much more dense than they would have been originally. And if we go to the mixed severity plots, these were actually coincident with those areas that elders described as needing more kind of forest cover. So things like hunting, those forest resources that were also important for some of their village sites, but they would have gone further afield to look for them. And so these mixed severity plots were also coincident with kind of a different type of Indigenous stewardship. And this helped to create a very pyrodiverse landscape. So a landscape where different fire was occurring, but also different land use was occurring that influenced the way that fire was functioning on these ecosystems. And so in this case, we have forests that were perhaps a little bit more naturally more dense. But what we've seen with the absence of fire in these landscapes is that the forests now look much more homogeneous than they would have otherwise had this level of pyrodiversity been able to continue. And so at this point, I will be talking a little bit more about the impacts of colonization on fire, but also on people. And if you'd prefer not to hear about this, then I welcome you to mute your microphone. And again, I will show the picture of the full tree when I'm done speaking about this.
Yeah, I guess so.
So essentially, what I think this picture is showing us is that we're seeing a colonization of fire. And so this is the last graph, last set of graphs I'm going to show you, I promise. And across the bottom is, again, a timeline. And what this line is showing is the number of fires that accumulate through time. So the slope of the line indicates how fast fires are actually happening out at Flat Rock. So the shallower lines, so the ones where the slope is a lot more flat, that means there's less fire on the landscape. And if the line is steeper, that means there's more fire on the landscape. So if we zoom all the way out to the whole of Flat Rock, we can actually look at these three kind of break points that are labeled here, 1661, 1809, and 1916, when the rate at which fires were occurring on the landscape shifted. And you can see an increase through time, and then starting in 1916, a major decrease in the amount of fire. And this is that same pattern I showed earlier, where we had lots of red bars and then very few red bars after kind of, the 1900s period in time. And so this is, if you just kind of looked at the site level and interpreted it at this stage, we might think, well, this is right when the Forest Act was put into place in BC, which established the kind of Forest Service and eventually led to kind of policies of fire suppression and fire control. It's also around the time when the railway came into Williams Lake, and with it came more and more people settling into the area. If we then break it down, though, by those 10 mixed severity plots and those 10 low severity plots, we actually begin to see a slightly different pattern. The mixed severity plots, so those shown here in purple, actually trend really closely with what's happening at the site as a whole. But when we look at where the low severity fires stop, these stop much sooner. So nearly 50 years before the fires in the mixed severity plots stop. In the 1870s, the fires in the low severity plots really begin to cease. And this timing aligns much more closely with when the kind of gold rush really started in the area, and the kind of major impacts of colonization began to happen. So the Bushfire Act was put into place in 1874, and that was kind of the first piece of legislation that prohibited intentional burning, including Indigenous fire stewardship. And it's also coincident with the smallpox epidemic that likely killed up to 2/3 of the Indigenous population in the region, and led to the kind of easier implementation of the Indian Act and forcing people into reserves, not allowing First Nations people to purchase or work land outside of those reserves, and then also the residential schools. And so all of these impacts kind of piled on top of one another really perpetuated an inability for Indigenous peoples to practice fire stewardship and shifted the way that we think about fire in the province as a whole. But what we're seeing here is the way that it actually shifted fire on the landscape. And if you'll remember, these low severity fires are the ones that were primarily in those areas that were of higher use by Indigenous peoples in the region. And these really ended with colonization. So I'll give folks just a moment to return and breathe if they need to. And I'm just about wrapping up. So I will say that this piece of research is now embedded within a much bigger network of research that's happening. So my small single site study is the red circle that you can see kind of up in the middle left there. But there's a whole network of sites that's actually that were developed in 1994 and 2002, as well as some work by a colleague of mine out at the Knife Creek block of the Alex Fraser Research Forest. But a colleague of mine, Mike Stefanik, those green circles are fire histories that he's actually adding down in Stewacum-Hikum territory. And the hope is that by kind of expanding this network, we can begin to think about these, the historical fire regimes and the drivers of fire regimes in a lot more detail and over bigger spaces. So with all of this work, for me, what is the future of fire? Well, we recognize that we have to align the restoration of fire in these open forest structures with both Indigenous and local community values. But we also have to recognize the history of place. So the fact that the current forest density is really a legacy of both fire exclusion and fire suppression, which are maybe two distinct things that we don't often think about. Second is the importance of these mixed severity fire regimes in these ecosystems and the pyrodiversity and heterogeneity of forest structures that they helped to create. And finally, I think this understanding of the role that Indigenous fire stewardship played, as well as just stewardship of the land more broadly, can help us understand ways to reintroduce fire and the objectives that they were trying to create. And this is all with the hope that we can restore some of the kind of landscape level heterogeneity, maintain all of the unique values that exist up at Flat Rock, and do so in a way that's more collaborative and also protects us from uncharacteristic high severity fires in the future. So I think I'm on time, maybe a little bit over, but with that, I'd just like to acknowledge the collaborators on this work, the elders, Sugarcane Archaeology, the Williams Lake Community Forest, Ken for all of your work in helping guide this and keep it grounded, all of the funders and all of the many people who helped make the research possible. Thank you.